Hey folks, we're going to talk about Chapter 3 today, Intercultural Communication. So let's define culture. A lot of people tend to use a lot of different definitions for culture, but the true definition of culture is it's the language, the values, the beliefs, the traditions, and the customs that people share and learn. So your culture is all encompassing. Where did you learn your language? Where did you learn your values? Where did you learn your traditions? This could be your family. This could be your school setting. This could be other important people in your life. This could be your churches and houses of worship. All these come together to make your culture. Another term we have to be familiar with is salience. Salience just means how much weight we attach to a particular person or phenomenon. Okay? So, for example, in the South, we'll learn later on in this chapter that religion and Christianity are very salient in the South. It's very common in this area for someone to ask you where you go to church and just assume that people go to church. Another example would be like high schools tend to have a lot of salience for the football team. How the football team's doing is very important to the school. It holds a lot of weight. Two other quick terms is in-groups. In-groups are groups that we identify with, whether maybe you identify as being a Latina, maybe you identify with being a son or a father or a member of a sexuality. All these things are your in-group. All these groups are your in-groups. And then your out-groups are just the opposite. They're just the groups of people that we view differently than us. Okay, so the next term we're going to talk about is a co-culture. Now this term, I haven't heard it before reading our textbook, but it's the perception or membership that is part of a group that's a part of an encompassing culture. So it includes things like your ethnicity and race are your co-culture, your religion, your sexual orientation or gender identity, your ability or disability, your age, the generation in which you grew up in, and your socioeconomic status. All these things become a part of your overall encompassing culture, so we're going to refer to them as co-cultures. Much of how we see ourselves and our self-concept relates to others from our co-cultural identity. So the people that we let influence our self-concept usually are people that we share our co-cultural identity with. Okay, so here's another question for you. What's the difference between ethnicity and race? Well, we have to remember that race is a social construct. We're really 97% identical as humans, even when we're from different races. But we give race a lot of salience or a lot of importance. Okay, race was originally created to explain biological differences among people whose ancestors were from different regions of the world. On the other hand, ethnicity is another social construct, but this refers to the degree of which a particular group, usually nationality or culture or religion, you feel you belong to. Here are some other examples of co-cultures. The region in which you live. Okay, you get a sense of belonging, and it helps you determine how you're going to view other people coming from different regions. Your sexual orientation. A couple things about this. It's now accepted that gender identity may change over time, and it's not strictly tied to physical features. Being transgender also does not mean that person is gay. Religion, like I mentioned earlier, is very salient in different parts of the world, in the U.S. especially. In the South, religion is very salient. Jewish people, their religion is very salient. They must marry people of the same religion. Physical ability and disability is another co-culture. People with disabilities often find that belonging to a group is rewarding to their life. One example of this is how deaf culture came about. At one time, deaf people were looked at as being less than because of their hearing impairment or hearing loss. But we didn't take into account the culture of the people that are deaf, and we've come to view them as a whole culture. Okay, it's a different culture being deaf. Another example is age and generation. A lot of your Western cultures value youth. A lot of attitudes about aging tend to be negative. We have a lot of words in our language that are negative for older people, like old fuddy-dud or something like that. But you have to remember that there's other cultures, like Eastern cultures, that tend to revere the old. And then we have socioeconomic status. People in the U.S. usually identify as either being working class, middle class, or upper class. People feel a sense of solidarity with the people from the same social strata as them, and this is especially true for the working class. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some norms or values that can shape our communication. First one is important. It's called individualistic versus collectivistic. What an individualistic culture is, it's a culture where members focus on the welfare and goal attainment of themselves. Okay? In collectivistic cultures, they focus on the welfare and the goals of the group or the culture as a whole. So in an individualistic culture, we value conflict. We're looking to, get what we deserve. In collectivistic cultures, they stress harmony over the conflict. In individualistic cultures, we value the superstar, while in more collectivistic cultures, we value the team player. And in individualistic cultures, we tend to value our personal accomplishment, what I did, while in collectivistic cultures, we value the shared accomplishment of the culture. The next one is high and low context. There's two distinct ways that members of various cultures deliver messages. In low context cultures, people use language to express their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and ideas as directly as possible. Okay, so what happens in low context cultures is that there's not a lot taken for granted in the context. So we are more direct with our language. We express thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and ideas as directly as possible. In high context cultures, the reason why it's called high context is because people rely on subtle nonverbal cues to maintain social harmony. More of how you're supposed to act and feel is in the context. So, for example, where in our culture, which is low context, we'll be direct and share our feelings and beliefs with you. In high context cultures, they wouldn't do that. They would rely on social cues and keeping the harmony. So it's just a cultural difference. Okay, another cultural norm or value that shapes our communication is uncertainty avoidance. And this just looks at the tendency to seek stability and honor tradition versus welcoming risk, uncertainty, and change. So countries that avoid uncertainty or don't like change are going to be Belgium, Greece, Japan, Portugal. But countries that embrace uncertainty would be Singapore, Great Britain, Denmark, and the US. Okay, the next one is power distance. This is the degree to which members of a culture or group are willing to accept power differences. Okay, so if, there's like the working class and then the upper class, how do people accept that? Well, low power distance countries are not willing to accept great differences in the power between people. These include Austria, Denmark, New Zealand, and Israel. While more high-power distance countries include the Philippines, Mexico, Venezuela, India, Japan, and Singapore. And what that means in those cultures, they accept the fact that there's people that have power over them, and they can deal with that high difference in power. The next one is talk and silence. Remember, when you see someone who's just being silent, we tend to think they're being stuck up, but it could be a cultural thing. So let's talk about this. People in Western cultures tend to view talk as desirable. So in the US, we like people to talk, and we use it for social purposes, to get to know people, as well as to get jobs done. But in silence in our culture has a more negative view. We think someone's unintelligent or insecure if they're remaining silent. But in Asian culture, Asian culture, silence is more revered. Okay? They discourage expression of thoughts and feelings. In much talk, there's great weariness. In another culture that's like this is Native American cultures. They also valued silence. So remember, when someone's being silent around you, it may not be that they're stuck up. It may be a cultural difference. And the last one we're going to talk about is competition and cooperation. This is formerly known as masculine and feminine cultures. So at one time we said masculine cultures were cultures where the men went and completed all the financial worries and women take care of the home. Gender roles were really specific, but now we call that a competitive culture, competition. Whereas cultures that stress cooperation view gender roles are less differentiated. Okay, you might have, a man doing housework and a woman making money, and you might combine different things. It emphasizes equality, relationships, and consensus. Okay, so now let's be practical and talk about learning about a new culture. If you want to learn about a culture, here are some practical tips to help you learn about a different culture. Number one, spend time with people from different backgrounds. If you're going to go to a specific culture, try and engage conversations with people from these backgrounds. You can do this online. So if you're not, going to travel there right away and you want to learn about the culture, you can interact with people in chat rooms. You can interact with people via social media in these cultures and ask them questions and just kind of get to know them. The next step is to develop a tolerance for ambiguity. Okay, what that means is learn to accept different things about different cultures. Just because it's different from your culture doesn't mean it's bad. It's just differently. So that leads us to the next thing, which is avoiding ethnocentrism. This is an important word. We'll come back to it several times. When you're being ethnocentric, you're using your culture as like the benchmark, or you think your culture does everything the best, and other cultures that are different you look at as inferior. So you try and avoid this and just say, it's different. It's not bad, it's just different. Another important term is to avoid stereotyping. What stereotypes are just overgeneralizations about people. We've heard them about races, sexual orientations. We've heard them about genders. We've heard them about just hair color. So just avoid stereotypes. You're not seeing the people themselves. You're seeing an overgeneralization of people. You can also gain experience with the culture. And again, this can be done either passive observation, or you can be more active about it and talk to people and self-disclose to these people so you learn about it. But always be patient and persistent. And the last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is coping with culture shock. Culture shock is also known as adjustment shock. And what it is after the honeymoon phase, after the newness of the culture wears off and you're not as excited as you once were about the culture, it's typical to feel confused, lonesome, and homesick. It may feel like you're in crisis, but don't be too hard on yourself. Homesickness is normal. You will make progress, but there will be setbacks along the way. And don't forget to reach out to others in the new culture that you're shocked about being in to get some support, and they will become part of your support system in this new culture. Okay, so that was chapter 3, a quick review of culture and some words to be familiar with: salience, culture, ethnocentrism, stereotyping. So for chapter 3, this is Matt Malloy signing off.